Welcome. So I assume that many listeners on the show are familiar with the fact that American economic growth started to stagnate starting in 1973. This is probably one of the most discussed topics in tech and econ circles, and my guest today is an expert on the issue. Eli Dourado is the chief economist at the Abundance Institute and one of the most interesting thinkers and investors in hard tech. We talk about whether ideas are getting harder to find, culture's influence on economic growth, and Joseph Tainer's theory of societal collapse. I hope you enjoy it, so let's jump right in. All right, I'm here today with Eli Dourado. Eli, welcome.
Dan, it's great to be here.
Great. So first question, what do you think is the most important metric you think about outside of total factor productivity? So maybe another framing of this would be like, is there anything that you would not sacrifice for us to achieve 2% total factor productivity?
Yeah, so I think in terms like much more important than economic growth actually is like human rights and other kinds of just decency kind of well-being type things that are I would place that higher than economic growth actually on my like hierarchy of needs. That does matter more to me. I think we've attained like a reasonable level of that. So it's not, and I think they're not really in conflict with each other. So I think like at the margin, the more important thing for most U.S. based people is economic growth, but I definitely wouldn't want to sacrifice like sort of like the more civic qualities that we already have, and could improve, but like it seems like good enough, and so at the margin, I think it's like more important to have economic growth, but yeah, I wouldn't sacrifice kind of those sort of like basic freedoms, freedom of speech, etc.
Yeah, and that makes total sense. What about something quantitative, like specifically from economics? Are there any economic indicators that you think like, hey, if we're going to shoot for 2% TFP growth, we should be watching this one and make sure it doesn't get impacted?
Yeah, I mean, I think like sometimes people talk about inequality, right? And they think of like growth and inequality as being at odds. And I happen to think it's like not true at all, right? Like if you look at sort of the data, like inequality has been increasing in the low TFP growth era, right? So and you see like massive inequality in TFP growth by industry, which implies also by like geography. So like we have huge tech boom in San Francisco, like people in Arkansas are not necessarily doing so well from that, and sort of the remedy is to increase TFP growth like across all industries, and that I think actually improves inequality. But like I would worry if we were getting some sort of boom that like was leaving people behind, that would concern me significantly. So you don't want to have like growth without it being broad based, or with it being less broad based than you were before, right? Like so if it was the case that we were getting like huge TFP growth, but like say 20% of the population was just like worse off than before, like that would trouble me quite a lot.
And what's the right way to think about inequality? Let's say that the wealth of everybody goes up, including like, at the bottom quartile as well, but inequality increases. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? How do we think about that?
Yeah. So I think it's like fine on its own if everyone's going up, right? The thing that worries me is political stability. So like if and this is like something I even like wrote about in my dissertation, right? Like people have to feel like they're getting part of the surplus of being members of society, right? Being part of society. And if they don't, then that's when you start getting people getting concerned about like, or you start raising for me concerns that people might like defect from the system, right? Like, and that can take like a number of forms, apathy or just like outright hostility to like the existing system. And that's actually like something I worry that we're going through today is like we haven't delivered growth. We definitely haven't delivered growth in all parts of the country, in all parts of the income spectrum, in all industries, and so on. And so I think that there's like a fraction of the population, I don't know how big it is, that like doesn't care about our society, about like our, sort of the common good. And, that worries me. So I think of that as like a reason to have more growth, right? Like, and so I don't think of it as at odds with like broad-based TFP growth, but I can imagine a scenario where they are at odds, right? And then that would concern me.
Got it. Are ideas actually getting harder to find?
Well, okay. So I think you probably know that my general take is that whether or not they're getting harder to find, that's not the reason why we're stagnating. So that I'll just preface it with that. But I think that they are getting harder to find in some fields and easier to find in others. So like fundamental physics, it's probably getting harder to find. Like we're kind of, I think there still is new physics to discover, but like it's like big teams and like lots like $1 billion pieces of equipment and so on that we need to like make progress on that. I think in other areas, say biology is the one that I feel most strongly about. Like if you think about like what a graduate student in biology, like by themselves in like a normally equipped lab, is able to do today versus what they could do, like the best teams of like well-funded senior biologists could do 50 years ago. Like the grad student today can do more. Like you can sequence DNA, can edit DNA, can like create new synthetic organisms, etc. Right. So I think in like biology, ideas are getting easier to find, and physics are getting harder to find. And it just kind of depends on the tools that are being developed, right? Like the new levels of abstraction that they're generating, like sort of new tools that serve as platforms that are like new abstractions. So you don't actually have to like learn about how to do a million things to unlock the new capability. I think those are kind of areas where it's getting easier to find, right? Like software too. Like computer programmers do not need to know how a computer works today for the most part, right? Or at least most computer programmers don't need to know that. So you sort of abstract from all that burden of knowledge, and it's easier than ever to make progress for them.
So economics is a field. I think many people have a feeling that it's gotten a lot weirder over the past few years. COVID kind of like broke a lot of people's general models of how the world should work. I'm just curious, like what you think of the field as economics. You view it in higher or lower regard than you did pre-COVID?
I've been on this interesting path of like being trained as an economist and like coming to identify less and less with the field like over time.
Mm.
Like when you're in grad school, you're getting a PhD or whatever. Like you really want to be like accepted as part of the field or whatever, and by your peers and by the sort of senior members of the field. And like more and more, I just sort of like don't put labels on it and just like kind of like I'm going to do what I find most interesting, and whether or not it's economics or whatever is kind of irrelevant to me. I'm not very like self-conscious about the field anymore. I'm curious what do you think has gotten weirder about it? Like give me your case.
Probably the most salient one is just inflation and government spending during COVID. I think that like
Ah,
pretty much everything, just like basic models of how the
oh,
world should work. It just seemed like nobody was very good at all at predicting how the economy would behave. Housing has been very
yeah.
weird. There's like several of these things where I think the markets are just behaving different than people would have expected.
Okay. So I was thinking you meant like more like academic economics or like the like sort of the like the profession with a capital P.
And that works too. Yeah, yeah. That's interesting as well.
Yeah, I think that the thing that has been underrated by economists, like sort of doing forecasting, is like demographics. And so thinking about, the problem in, say 20 years ago and for a few years before that was the global savings glut, right? Like you had like very low interest rates and so on. I think that's an artifact of like the baby boom and the fact you had like a high percentage of the population was like in peak earning years and also peak saving years. So like if you're earning a lot and saving a lot, so that means you're producing a lot. You're not consuming as many goods, right? So there's like this glut of goods on the market, and everyone wants to save, and that's going to be a period with low interest rates because it's like penalizing saving, right? And now we're kind of through that. So if you think about these like multi-decade long trends, I think like when the baby boomers like retire, that like shifts the trend like pretty significantly because all of a sudden like that the big hump of big demographic hump is no longer saving they're and producing a lot and saving a lot. They're producing zero and dissaving, right? They're spending down their savings, and so that has a big impact on or should you'd predict that would have a big impact on interest rates and inflation, and we'd no longer be at this point where you could just keep interest rates low forever and not get inflation out of it. So I think that like that may be what's going on, but like I'm not like 100% confident that that's the main explanation, and like B, like I don't think anybody was very few people were building that into models. And C, like you're right, it's crazy. Like sort of if this keeps going, like the amount of sort of the federal budget deficit and the amount of like increased expense that we're going to have supporting old people over the next 10 years or longer, it's just, people are losing their minds, and I don't see how we can support it. I mean, then again, like if you had told me like the path that we would be on in certain deficits, 20 years ago, I would have said like that's not sustainable. That can't happen. So I've been continually surprised by the amount of the deficits.
We're talking a bit about your background in academia, and I understand, anyways, Tyler Cowen was your PhD advisor.
Yeah.
Where did he most influence you?
Oh gosh, like so many ways. I think the number one thing is having multiple models of the world in your head at the same time, and sort of having like a portfolio approach to thinking about the world, not holding any one of them like too strongly, like being able to see multiple sides of a question. It sounds like basic, but I think a lot of people don't do that, and Tyler's very good at sort of asking the right question to make you do that, be able to explain all the sides and actually see them as like having some value. Even if it's like your minority position or whatever in your head, in your portfolio, in your head, it has some value and it has some explanatory power, and you don't want to dismiss it. So that kind of like open-mindedness, I think, is really important. The sort of the value of studying widely, of bringing in models from sort of different parts of economics and from outside of economics, and sort of seeing the applicability of those models to the question that you're interested in. So like Tyler's a lot of his early work was like influenced by like finance models, right? So he was like like thinking about like like Fisher Black and stuff like that. And so of course I like read all the Fisher Black stuff, and and it became influential for me as well. But thinking about like, okay, like how does this influence questions of like macroeconomics if you have like a finance underpinning behind your thinking, right? And then just completely other fields, you gotta think about it in terms of like those different inputs. So I would say those are some ways. Plus he's just like a very very kind and very like he's a student of human nature, right? So he if you're kind of working with him, like he will study you, right? Like, and he will he will kind of like develop a model of like who you are, and he's like I said, very kind, like always, like I think had something constructive and helpful to say.
Yeah, I mean, that last piece, the older I get, I feel like the more important I realize that is in whoever you work with. Just
yes, exactly.
That's great. So we're going to talk a bit about just technology and regulations as sort of drivers of economic growth, but the one driver I wanted to ask you about is culture. How much weight do you place on cultural factors in driving economic growth?
Certainly, it has an impact, and I kind of don't know how to operationalize it, right? So I think for one, like culture seems to be influenced a lot by material factors, right? So like so economic conditions, right? Like I don't know, even the style of music, right? Like so you have like like economic growth in the 80s, like you have like poppy, like happy music, and then like there's a depression or recession in the early 90s, and you get like grunge, and so I don't know. So I think there's like some inputs there. Yeah, I don't know. I think the other piece of this that you could look at is so we were growing pretty fast from, let's say, 1920 to through the early 1970s. I do think like part of the thing that led to stagnation in the early 73 or so was that by the early to mid 1960s we started to see some of the economic growth culturally. We started to a take it for granted, and b view it as like somewhat fake, right? So like you have even like Ralph Nader's like like, oh, it's unsafe, right? Like so where it's like, yeah, we're like growing, but it's like unsafe. So it's like we're not factoring in like those, like he didn't probably say it this way, but I would say like once you account for the the unsafe, if you put that economic factor that in that economic value, like we're not growing as fast as we think we are. And then you have like Rachel Carson, like Silent Spring, right? Like this is another way in which the growth is fake, because we're not accounting for the decrease in biodiversity or in environmental amenities that we have, right? So it's like you kind of see if the culture starts to see, has, maybe even some valid critiques of sort of like the growth that you're having, right? There's just gonna be a backlash and sort of a push for increased attention on those parts of the notional growth that they say you're not getting, right? And I think that's maybe what happened, but I don't know how to like measure culture, or so multidimensional. Like how do you how can you even say like we have, it's not just like more or less culture, right? It's culture in all these different dimensions. But like certainly like if you look at internationally, right, the cross sectional, like across countries, like the US has a certain culture that does seem to be well suited to sort of entrepreneurship and other sort of kinds of activity that like is conducive to us being at the frontier, right? Whereas like other cultures are either more inherently pessimistic or more deeply cynical or something like that makes them not well suited to that.
Yeah, and I actually had this question ahead of time, so it's good you led to this, which is why has there only been one United States? And it's not like the US is perfect, but I think if you look at human history, our story of growth looks probably very, very different without the US, and it seems to be an outlier. It's not totally clear that someone else would have stepped in to take the place in the same way that we did. That almost leads you to believe that like there's either a positive growth sentiment is like not part of human nature, or corruption is a part of human nature. All of these things that the majority of countries deal heavily with. Why do you think there was only one?
I think the US benefited a lot from geographic isolation, right? Like being so far away from any threats from peer countries, right? Like I mean, the history of Europe is they're all like invading each other all the time, right? They develop in that way, and that it means like they do need more centralized government, right? They need more. It's more of a like when you have a wartime footing, you need centralized command and control, right? Or at least maybe you don't, but like let's at least go with that. You probably need more centralized command and control than you would otherwise, at least. And the U.S. hasn't had that need because there hasn't been a like real threat of invasion. It's been less centralized command and control. I mean, like I think parts of the American West for most of American history have been like ungovernable, basically from Washington. Tyler has this paper about like does technology drive the growth of government, right? Like so like without computers or whatever, like you wouldn't be able to keep all the records that you would need to have like a large administrative state. But just like sort of seeing the U.S. as like for most of its history is basically ungovernable, like created like a unique culture that like sort of valued the individual and like the contributions of the individual. Whereas like in Germany, like okay, they have these train systems and like because they have to be able to like move like war material to the front lines or whatever, right? And the U.S. is just like we can't control what happens in most of our country. So I think that's like a big part of it is that when you have centralized control, it's like much higher variance, right? Like you can have really good outcomes that come from central direction, but you can also have these like disastrous centralized policies. And the U.S. just sort of taking a more decentralized governance path has just chugged along at like a more or less like constant rate without any like major setbacks, and that kind of I think maybe has contributed to it. And I think the other thing is that there is like a sort of a path dependence here. Like there's some recent papers came out, I guess last year, NBER working papers on zero sum thinking, right? And the sort of conclusion of the paper is like, okay, like positive sum attitudes and thinking causes is a causal factor in economic growth, but the causation also runs the other way. So like if you grow up sort of in a stagnant or declining economic environment, you're more likely to be a zero sum thinker, right? Because if in fact the economy is zero sum and basically not growing, then you're going to be a zero sum thinker, and then that leaves you in a harder like once you're locked into those thinking patterns, it's like hard socially to get out of them. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that's a complete answer to your question, but like those are kind of like where my mind goes when you ask it.
Yeah. I'm curious about education. So, like, how important do you think education policy is for like the eventual goal of increasing total factor productivity? It strikes me that it's now becoming pretty easy to teach yourself very high levels of any technical thing you want to learn online, and you could just meet people online and get engaged in communities a lot easier. Is education policy going to be like more or less relevant over the next few years?
Well, like the funny thing about education is it probably hasn't been about conveying information for like a long time. Like even say 50 years ago, you could get a library card and go down to the library and get any book you wanted. Like once you learned to read, at least you could in principle like go down and like, read the books, read the journal articles even, and teach yourself anything you want to know. So like I think a lot of education is really about motivating students, right? Like coaching them, like keeping their interest levels up. Another important component of education, of course, is babysitting, right? So like the reason we have schools in large part is because parents have to work. The other like sort of finding that I think it's pretty robust, right? Is that like we're not necessarily teaching like the most effective in the most effective manner. Like the most effective manner is like tutorial style with mastery based learning, right? So if you had something like that, you could get like maybe much better outcomes, and we're not in general doing a good job, right? So students are for the most part meeting like grade level expectations, but if you then go back and like survey American adults, like something like over half of US adults, I think 53% was the latest data, don't read at a sixth grade level, right? Which means like they can read like multiple texts and sort of like compare and contrast and like compare the sources and sort of draw conclusions from like the different things that they read in the multiple sources, right? So if you're thinking like that's the standard, it's like everyone should read at the sixth grade level, right? We're not doing it. So it's like we're not illiterate. We can read, but we can't, and obviously students are attaining those standards as they're going through school, but then once they're out of school, like it goes away. So I don't know. I think one thing I've been thinking about lately is to what extent can AI tools, LLMs, etc., like sort of make the mastery based system more accessible for everybody. So if you have an LLM that is coaching you, that is sort of trying to keep you engaged, that is and is always at your level, right? Like sort of giving you material that is appropriate for what you already know, like reviewing what you already know at like sort of a spaced interval, making sure that you retain it, and is fun and engaging in that way. Like you could imagine like a sort of inversion of the school where you're like, you have some tablet or whatever that like does the teaching. And then you still like schools are still going to have a babysitting function. So you still need like human teachers there most of the time, but they don't have to like be specialists in like how to convey certain information. They can be there to like meet the child's emotional needs, to make sure fights don't break out, like sort of care for the child. And so it's a different kind of person that you would hire to be a teacher in that world. But I think you still need teachers. I think yeah. So like my question for the next 10 years of education policy is to what extent can we realize the dream of Neil Stephenson wrote about the Young Ladies Illustrated primer and in the Diamond Age, and if you could have something like that available to all students, and then sort of like decouple like the sort of like the teacher figure from actual doing education. I think that would be like maybe the best way forward. But yeah, I mean, it is. I do think like sort of education matters, but it's not so much like how effective are you at communicating the information to children, but like how good are you at like fostering love of learning and sort of like creating an association in the children that like doesn't make them want to like graduate and then like never read again.
Yeah. So I want to revisit your 2020 posts on notes on technology in the 2020s, right? And so you go down a list of a bunch of different areas and talk about potential technologies that might push total factor productivity up to that 2% rate. Just broadly speaking, before we dive into like any specific area, do you feel like more or less confident sitting here in 2024 that this is an achievable goal than you did when you wrote this in 2020?
I think like in terms of the goal is to increase TFP. Yeah, I think it's like very achievable. I don't think all the detail I had in that post was right by any means, but no, I feel like it's still very much achievable.
But what I'd like to do is go through each one and just see if you have like, do you have any interesting updates off the top of your head in the last, it's 4 years. So in the last couple of years, have there been any interesting breakthroughs that are worth noting?
Yeah. So one of them off the top of my head, I think I was pretty bearish on battery improvements in the post. And today I'm way more bullish on it. And in particular, I mean, I ended up making a battery investment. So that, so that's why.
What changed there? Why are you more bullish now?
Well, better understanding of the bottlenecks in batteries, and actually like seeing the like that bottle. Like I think that like there's a company that I invested in that is like going to smash that bottleneck. So
Yeah.
so the what I kind of realized is the bottleneck is cathodes. So and like most battery startups or whatever are working on better anodes, which is not the bottleneck. But cathodes, we kind of only have two in lithium ion. We have the nickel, manganese, cobalt cathodes, and those are higher density than the other one, but more expensive. And then there's lithium ferrophosphate, or it's iron based cathode, and those are cheaper but less dense, right? And so those are kind of the two paths forward. Like we are seeing like sort of the prices of battery cells sort of start to stall out. So like in the sense that we had for a long time we had like 20% annual cost improvements, and now we have like 5% annual cost improvements over the last 5 or so years. So that is like stalling. But I think like a new cathode that is denser and cheaper will just be like a game changer. And so I invested in this company called Oros, and I think they have that. They've already tested it in like single layer cells and confirmed like it is much denser, and it is also much cheaper than NMC or LFP. So I think like that's like one like I got wrong and actually like made a bet on the other side of it.
Okay. Actually, another bet you made was on space. So you bet Robin Hanson $100 against his $200. But in your bet was that human would set foot on Mars by the end of Q1 2030. Now, sitting here 4 years later, would you double down, or
No, I
are
think
you
I'm
less
going to lose.
confident? You think you're going to lose? Okay.
And to be fair, I got 2-1 odds, right? Because I explicitly I told Robin I was like 40% confident, and so he offered me 2-1 odds, which was generous. And but I am less confident now. I only because I think the schedule will slip. I do think like Starship will enable that to happen at some point, but it might be 4 years later or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. What about in biotech and health? So the main things you talked about there were mRNA vaccines and DeepMind's protein folding. And both of these were strike me as like more, technology breakthroughs that were like waiting to be commercialized. Do you have any updates off the top of your head on either of those that make you either more or less bullish?
I've been thinking a lot about gene therapy in the last couple of weeks. I think it is just like and sort of like related to mRNA, but not only mRNA. There's just sort of the sort of biomolecular kinds of treatments, and I just think the potential is just so enormous. And my concern right now is that the regulatory system is not right for those kinds of breakthroughs. So yeah, so when you have these biomolecular treatments, like they're big molecules, right? And the existing like drug approval system is kind of designed for small molecules, so, like in terms of even like preclinical testing for like toxicity, right? Well, toxicity in small molecules happens because the molecule like accumulates in some organ or something like that and causes damage, right? So what they do is like, okay, you put this in like a mouse and like pump up I mean, it's actually kind of cruel, right? Like we pump
Yeah.
up the doses so high that like we determine like what the LD50 is, what the lethal dose is that 50% of the mice die, right? And then like you make sure that the human dose like on a per kilogram basis is like way lower than that when you do it in human trials, right? And just like with these molecules that are bigger, that are they're more sort of the natural like language of our existing cells. Like there's not really that same concern. I mean, the immune system will clear it automatically because it's like used to dealing with molecules of that size. If it's too much, to the point that like we've had to like redefine toxicity for biologics, right? So it doesn't even mean the same thing, but they still require like toxicity testing, and so I worry a lot about that. I think like so I'm concerned that we won't like reap all the benefits of those breakthroughs, but I think they are huge. They're very very significant, and you could have a different kind of system where maybe you regulate like the vector or the platform where you administer how you deliver the sort of genetic payload to the cell, but you don't regulate the exact payload, and it's kind of like doctor's discretion in the same way that like a surgery. You don't like the doctors don't get like every individual surgery FDA approved, even though they're like completely unique and customized to the needs of the patient. There was some positive news this week. FDA was like Congress basically instructed FDA to come out with like a way to like identify these sort of more genetic platforms, gene therapy and other biologic platforms. And so FDA is like issued some draft guidance, like saying like how they'll do it. I don't know. I don't know enough about it to evaluate whether that's going to be like sufficient or it's not, doesn't go far enough or whatever. But I think is like incredibly powerful. Like on the sort of like multi-decade timeline, it's going to be very important.
Yep. Okay. Let's talk about energy. The main topics you discussed were wind, solar, batteries we already talked about. But the big one that like was, I didn't know a lot about is geothermal. And I think like it seems like nuclear gets a lot of attention right now because there's a bunch of policy disputes going on all over the world about should we do nuclear, should we not? So you get a bunch of people that kind of take a hard stance on each side. But you kind of state that geothermal has like potential to maybe make nuclear not even relevant if it really works. What's been the latest on geothermal? Would you have any updates to the post in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think so. We've had some next generation test wells, or actually even commercial projects. So like Fervo did a project with Google for a data center, and the results were good. A lot of the model in terms of making geothermal economical is going to come down to drilling costs, and drilling costs seem to be getting very low, even with mechanical drilling. So like I made an investment in like energy based drilling. But my friend Austin Vernon keeps telling me like, oh, mechanical drilling is also getting cheap. So just like using regular drill bits and going through granite, there's a lot we could do to optimize those bits and the surrounding systems to go through granite. And that means that we can get, much deeper and get to hotter temperatures and so on. So everything seems like bullish. I think where maybe some update is that like I would say I think maybe like just like pure thermal energy might be a better, like that seems like the lowest hanging fruit for geothermal, right? Like so if you think about like a paper mill, right, it uses like 150-degree steam to like sort of do its run it through. It runs the 150-degree C steam through like pipes to like help with the drying of paper. That's low temperature heat that like geothermal can provide like very easily. And there's a bunch of like industrial products, dairy farms, right? Like they need heat to like pasteurize milk and stuff. And that's something you could decarbonize like very quickly with geothermal potentially. The electric conversion I think is still like on the table very much, like conversion to electricity. But like I think one thing that maybe I've updated on is I just think like steam turbines kind of suck.
Okay.
Like if you think about like how much like they're still important to us. This is like a couple 100-year-old technology, right? Coal plants, it's like, okay, you burn this rock and it, like you use that to make steam and then you use that to run a turbine. Well, like geothermal is also using a turbine. Like nuclear is also like, it's like putting neutrons to make heat to boil water to run through a turbine. And even like some fusion concepts, right? It's like still using neutrons to create heat to boil water to spin a turbine. And more I'm like appreciating the benefits of like solid state stuff. So like solar panel has no moving parts, and it's like easier to manufacture, or you get more cost improvements in manufacturing at scale because there's no moving parts. So yeah, it's sort of like the holy grail as I'm thinking about it is like something that is better for converting heat to electricity, like sort of efficiently, that is solid state and could be manufactured in a way similar to solar panels. And there are some ideas for this, and a lot of them maybe rely on higher temperatures, which you can't get to with say nuclear even. But like if we could do something like that, I think that would like sort of breathe life into a lot of like thermal sources.
Got it. Okay, we'll move on from this post. You articulate really well kind of this idea that just because you have a tech breakthrough doesn't really mean that it gets digested in the GDP numbers or is like useful to anyone. Like what you end up really needing, right, is you need someone to productize it and commercialize it and actually make it useful. Just as a thought experiment here, let's pretend that all tech progress on the breakthrough side paused tomorrow, but we still had our existing breakthroughs. So things like CRISPR or GPT-4 that like haven't really been dispersed throughout the economy. Do we have enough to budge TFP today? How excited are you about the existing just science breakthroughs?
Yeah, I think there's a lot It is a lot of gains, right? So, I mean, just like, as you may know, like supersonics is near and dear to my heart, and that's like
Hmm.
something we had, 50 years ago, right? Like Concorde's first flight, prototype flight was in 1969. So, like bringing back supersonic flight, it would be, a huge thing. But not even that. Like we have like ramjets, right? Which have, we've had since ramjet engines, like since I think the 1940s, maybe. I think the Soviets had one, and like, okay, we haven't commercialized that. So like you could go like easy Mach 3, Mach 4, right? Like based on existing technology, and if we could commercialize it. Yeah, and like a lot of the energy stuff is about deployment at scale. So wind, solar, geothermal, even. I mean, it depends on what you want to count as a tech breakthrough, because I think there is like significant learning by doing. So this is kind of, an important point, is that a lot of the progress I think is made outside of the science lab, but it's still like an innovation. It's still like an idea, and it comes from like deploying, having contact with the real world, like seeing what
Yeah.
goes wrong, iterating. Like, so if you think about like why SpaceX and Boeing have such divergent paths, right? It's like, well, Boeing just like designs the product, whether it's a rocket or capsule or an airplane, like they design the product end to end and then like build it and then fly it and expect it to work flawlessly. Whereas like SpaceX is like, well, we're gonna build like this like half-baked version, we're gonna fly it, we're gonna see where the weak points are, why it blows up, and then we're gonna, figure out like what the problems are, and address those in the next iteration. And iteration, speed is so important for development. I don't know if you count that as like pure ideas, or pure deployment, but it seems like really, really important, as attested by the fact that like SpaceX has a higher valuation than like Boeing's market cap with like a tenth of the employees. There's plenty of
Yeah.
gains. Like, a lot of the genetic stuff, like, like we don't need any fundamental breakthroughs to just deploy that at scale. You could cure a lot of illnesses. Like you would need like maybe some innovation in the sense of like designing the particular molecule for like this condition, but like no real breakthroughs are needed. Right? It's not like you just need to actually like design the stuff, administer it to people, see what goes wrong, like adapt,
Yeah.
and so on. So I think I
Yeah.
think there's plenty. Particularly if you count the sort of more iterative aspect of it. Like I think there's plenty that we could do.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Well, we don't have to make that trade-off, so that's great.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm curious, as someone who like goes really deep on all these different technologies, but then you also invest, how do you think about understanding which tech breakthroughs are going to be able to be turned into a useful product? So I feel like this is kind of like one of the really, really big questions of venture capital, right? But I feel like in these type of domains, it's actually a little bit even more challenging than in like a software business, because you're trying to figure out like, what does it mean that we had this scientific breakthrough? Does it actually have a useful application in the real world? So for like the investments that you make, how do you think about which technologies to bet on that you think will actually end up productizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're not betting on a technology. Usually, you're betting on a product, right? So like if a founder comes to me and it's like, I have this technology. First question is, okay, what's the product, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think just like don't invest if there's no product, right? Like if it's not like a proposed product, like I just wouldn't invest in it. If that product doesn't like obviously have a big market, like I wouldn't invest in it, right? So like sort of the screen is like, it's like if they can build this thing that they say that they can build, will it be $1 billion company, or multi-billion-dollar company, right? And if the answer is no, then that's like a screen right away to say no. And then like a third one is just like, do I understand how this works? And if you don't understand how it works, then I would say don't invest in this idea, right? I think this is actually like a big problem in hard tech VC, is
Yeah.
that there's like a lot of VCs that are mainly software funders, but they want to have like a little bit of a, they've seen like the success of SpaceX or whatever, and they like want to have like a little bit of a hard tech portion of their portfolio or something, but they don't actually know enough to diligence the idea, or they don't invest enough a lot of times. There's an unhealthy dynamic in venture where some people, okay, so Peter Thiel says, okay, you want to be contrarian, and everyone's like, oh yes, we want to be contrarian. But what they actually, not Peter, but most other VCs, like what they mean by that is like they want to be like 6 months ahead of the consensus. So like they want to like make the bet now in terms of like what will be the consensus belief like 6 months from now, And so
Yeah.
like you get a big markup like in 6 months because everyone like comes to believe it. And if that's like your play, like your object of study is not so much like the company as it is like your peers in the industry, right? So like
Yeah.
you're thinking about like what will these other firms believe in 6 months that I can bet on now that then they'll believe in it and it'll be like a markup for me and my investment. So yeah, like just basically like understanding at least just at a very basic level, like how does this technology or invention work is like table stakes, I think.
So when you invest in a deep tech company and you're looking at the founder, what's the most important skill set that you look for? And I'm assuming that this is different than like you might look for in a software founder.
In a hardware founder, like it's really important to like kind of know the field really well, right? Like know the industry really well. And like in a software founder, it's like, okay, do I need to know? Does he need to have like deep experience in like across the software industry and kind of know what the trends are and like know why what these technology stacks are or whatever. But like in a hardware founder, you know, they need to know their industry cold, I think. They need to really know like, well, why did this company fail, or like, what if I use this material to build my thing, like what are the trade-offs associated with that, and how to, how if I had to manufacture this like literally myself with my own hands, like how would I do it? I think that kind of expertise is like really valuable. And then I think the other thing that's like really important, I think this is probably also important in software, but it's just like iteration speed again, right? Like how important does the founder see speed, right? And the sort of like the cycle of like having at least something to test against the real world very quickly, and then to iterate and fix what went wrong. I think that's like really important as well.
Got it. Got it. So you commented on this, but this was kind of going around Twitter and the internet a lot. But Jensen Huang said in an interview that like he would have never started at NVIDIA if he knew how hard it would be. And you commented on a post basically saying like you think this sentiment is actually a pattern in hard tech, that like a lot of these founders end up saying like, I don't know if I would have done it if I knew how hard it would be. And so the implication that you draw here is that like maybe a little naivete is actually good. But like, is that just a fact of life that this stuff is painfully hard? To me, that would be sort of bad news, because like how much naivete can we have out there that feels like it would be a bottleneck to get people to go into this stuff. But I'm curious how you just think about that.
I think it is basically a fact of life. I mean, maybe it's bad news. I think the good news is that there's a lot of naivete out there, right?
Okay, okay.
So particularly with young people, right? Yes, it is way harder to build a company than you think, even if you adjust for like that fact, right? Like so even if
Yeah.
everybody tells you like it's going to be way harder than you think, like it's still going to be harder than you think. And I contrast this a little bit with like Google's Lab X, right? Like they have like this moonshot factory, right? And it's led by Astro Teller, who's like a super smart guy. But the whole MO of that lab is like, we're going to study this potential product and we're going to cut bait on the ones that seem too technically hard. Well, I think the result of that is that like you're cutting bait on everything.
Yeah.
Whereas if all those like were a founder led startup that like, has to go through like a year of hell to like get the product on the market, but they just like like they want to give up but they can't. I think they would actually like, there's some things that they probably cut bait on that like would have worked, or instead had been done by a founder who had funding, but like it just got, when it got hard, he just had no choice but to keep going. So yes, I think there's like a little bit of like, people, you have to do things. We do these things not because they're easy, but because we thought they would be easy, right? Like
Yeah,
that
yeah,
is that
yeah.
is like it is like I see that over and over again in hard tech startups. Is like it's always just like harder than you think. And then I think the other thing is like you have founders who are very technical, and like they have to learn the business side of it, right? They have to learn how to fundraise. They have to like, and it's just it can be excruciating. You do like 300 pitches or whatever, and like you still don't raise your round. That's like, well, guess what? You have to keep going. So it is hard.
So you've got founders, you've got corporate labs. What about the government? Like, when should they take on a hard tech project? Obviously, at some point in time, they take us to the moon. But in this day and age, what role do you think they have to play?
It's a good question. I think a lot of it is like a way that they can like be productively involved is in funding like first of a kind projects. like thinking about like geothermal, like, okay, there's like, I don't know what you want to say, like four different modalities that you could use that I would consider like next geothermal energy production, right? And like funding each one of like to show whoever the first company is to show up to like want to do like a discreetly new kind of well. If they would say, okay, like we will fund you to like do this project, I think that would be really valuable. And then okay, they do the project, hopefully it succeeds, and then like investors see that it succeeds, and like the private capital is there to go, take it to the next step. So there is an office of like clean energy demonstration that's supposed to do this. They don't have any geothermal money, interestingly, so they got funding for like a lot of things, but not geothermal. And then there's like a loan programs office, and they don't quite do this. They kind of take the next step, right? They don't want to take too much technical risk, but they are willing to be like, if the technical risk is like burned down, but like private markets still don't see that, then they kind of step in. So I think that's like one thing. I'm thinking about like say nuclear, right? Like so we have like a national nuclear reactor laboratory. It's called Idaho National Labs. Now they have not actually built a new reactor since the 1960s. So that has come to market. Building test reactors would be great. They are building one right now, but they haven't done it for they went like over 50 years. Like our nation's nuclear reactor laboratory, like going for over 50 years between test reactors. Then I think something like partnerships with industry, like so they kind of have at INL an exemption from NRC rules. They have like a lot of facilities that are out in the desert, and so you can imagine a regime where they basically say to all U.S. nuclear startups, like, you can come here, like, use our facilities, like, build your reactor in 6 months. You can test it destructively. You can blow it up out in the middle of the desert where like no one will get hurt, and then you can iterate, right? Like, iteration is so important, and that's something that's like not done in the nuclear industry, right? It's like it's basically like 12 years and $12 billion between reactors, and so like providing that like sort of facilities and safe harbor and sort of regulatory exemption would be really valuable in nuclear. I'm less enamored of like just like production subsidies. So if you think about like like the IRA, one of the things it does is it like puts these huge subsidies on clean energy generation, right? Like and that to me feels more like protectionism. There's this constant problem of in industrial policy of if you coddle an industry too much, it just gets fat and happy, right? Yeah. So like U.S. shipbuilding is a perfect example. Like we have as many shipbuilding workers as like pretty similar to numbers to like Korea and Japan, and we like produce way fewer ships than they do. So that sort of the protectionism we've done there has not worked well. I think something similar could happen in energy generation if you don't actually like face market pressures because your subsidies are so generous. You might stop innovating a little bit. To kind of answer your question, I think like governments can be helpful, but it's kind of hard, and it's like you have to think through carefully, whether you're helping or you're getting a lot of bang for your buck, or at least not being harmful in sort of the support that you're giving to like an industry. I also think NASA was like, I mean, so I spent a couple years at Boom working on policy and so on, and like had a great relationship with like NASA people, right? Like I remember like one time when we had to like learn, we had to figure out like how to learn to use some prediction software that was like NASA software, and we our engineers like tried to learn this, like couldn't do it. Like we hired like an outside consultant to like teach them, and like the consultant was basically like learning it as they went and then trying to teach our team, and it was like that didn't work. So I called up some contacts at NASA, and they were like, yeah, just fly out, like bring us a team, and like we'll kind of walk you through it. And they did, and it was great. It was just like an amazing like resource for the industry to have these NASA experts who are accessible and willing to like talk to engineers in the private sector.
Yeah, interesting. I was just looking this up in prep for this call, but it looks like the number of people that graduated with a computer science degree in the US, it increased from about like 40K in 2010 to over 100K today. And it's still growing like really, really rapidly year over year. Do you think we have too many people going into software?
Probably. I mean, like too many on, on what margins and what constraints are we talking about, right? Like I do worry. So like if you believe that like the physical world is like overregulated and it's hard to get things done in the physical world, though that increases like the rate of return in the software world where you have the First Amendment and where that means like that limits like sort of any sort of preemptive kind of publishing of software or something like that. And so the returns to software are probably higher than they should be, relative to the returns in other sectors. If you believe that like those other sectors are overregulated in a way that like depresses rate of return. Now, I don't know, like the computer science education, my understanding is like a lot of that's like super theoretical and not actually like very useful to industry. So I think like we're probably almost certainly, no matter what, overproducing people who like understand the church Turing thesis or
Sure. Yeah.
some of these more abstract and less relevant points of computer science.
So what about the corollary to this, which is, do you think we have enough top talent doing biotech, energy, transportation, these more physical world industries?
I mean, like I think it would be better if if the rate of return in those industries was higher, like we would get more talent flowing to them.
I guess this is the point. So is your view that like rate of return in the industry is what causes talent to flow to it?
I think so. I think it was at
Okay.
least part of it. Yeah, I mean, like there's more opportunity, right? Like so if there was higher returns in biotech because say FDA adopts some reform that's like more permissive, but yeah, also still like smart and good for the industry and like maintains like trust in those products and so on. Then yeah, I think there'd be like a gold rush, right, in biotech, and like more people would flow to that industry. So sort of making sure that you're not artificially depressing the rate of return in these other areas, I think is like how you should think about like managing talent flows. It's not about like not managing the talent flow in sort of like an isolate like directly, but making sure that the rate of return is like sufficiently high in those sectors.
Got it. So we've kind of alluded to in a lot of these questions this idea that regulation, broadly defined, kind of hinders productivity growth. So I'm curious if we have a new Elon Musk, let's say, and he's 12 right now, and we say he's going to go forth and like lead the country in some way. At the margin, do we need him more to be a policy expert and go and like, adjust policy and get into politics? Or do we need him to just say, screw it, I'll work within the existing bounds of how everything works and I'll just like do three more really good companies? Like where do we need that incrementally Elon Musk?
Yeah, I would say I would say do the thing. I would say like the policy stuff is important. Like obviously I'm working on the policy stuff, so I think it's important. But I also believe that you could even actually be more effective in policy change a lot of times if you have like an example or a thing that you're trying to push through. So when I was at the Mercator Center, I wrote a paper on supersonics, and like, okay, that paper circulated within DOT, like got some interest and stuff like that. But like we were able to like move the needle on supersonic policy more. Like I felt like I could see myself being able to move the needle more like once I got into the industry and was like actually like we want to build this thing and you need to change policy so that we can build this thing. And you can create jobs and whatever else, but like there's economic activity associated with it that the regulator doesn't want to stand in the way of. And so creating an intellectual foundation is important, but at the margin I would say it's like more people like pushing on the boundaries from within industry and like trying to do things that are that have regulatory risk. And I think a lot of times like regulatory risk, if what you're doing is actually like kind of a singular thing, like regulatory risk is sometimes lower than people think. Like I think regulators do want to accommodate. Like so, like when I say singular, I mean like okay, like cryptocurrency, like everyone's doing like cryptocurrency stuff. So like if you are just like I'm a crypto person and I want to like engage the SEC and change the rules, like that's gonna be tough because they have to like take everybody into account. But like if you're actually like have a sort of unique thing that you're trying to do, and I think regulators tend to be open to like engaging and figuring out a solution for you, particularly like if you're also investing in like lobbying and like they're getting letters from members of Congress or saying like what's going on here, like why are you stopping this like this one like entrepreneur from my district to like do this, right? So I think there's paths forward if you're kind of like one of these singular entrepreneurs.
Got it. So you've been talking about NEPA for many years. I think you're actually like the person where I first heard about it, and now it's kind of like everywhere. How close are we? And like, is there any realistic world where in the next couple of years it gets either repealed or reformed to the extent that it's not a serious hindrance to growth? What is your confidence on that?
I think there's interesting discussions going on in the Hill now and awareness of it. I don't think that the solutions that are being discussed are that go far enough, but I think like a possible like trajectory here is something passes, it's still not enough, and we keep beating our heads about it. But then I think ultimately the driving force for reform here is actually the climate movement. So like if you and that's not going away, right? So like if like we reform NEPA and like okay, it's still really hard to deploy clean energy. There's going to be more interest in even 2 years from now. Like so say we did something now, it wasn't enough. Like 2 years from now, the industry is going to be like, hey, this didn't work. Like we need more reform, right? And so I think yeah, I'm actually like super excited for the climate movement because they're like the one mainstream movement that's like not complacent, right? And this, so they actually like want and need a solution and will push hard for it and have like a sort of like a very strong conviction about it. And so if we want it, I mean, I think there's just like basically no way we can deploy clean energy on the scale that we need it, or the climate movement believes that we need it. And I think we could use actually more than even they think they need. But like that quantity of energy is not getting deployed, in any sort of like reasonable time frame without like bigger NEPA reform. So that would be like my point of optimism, is that like whatever we do that doesn't work won't. I don't think it's like a one and done kind of like, okay, we do a reform and then that sucks up all the attention and everyone says like, okay, we've done NEPA reform and now we can move on. I think it will be the case that we will like continue to enact reforms until something actually works to deploy energy, because the climate movement thinks it's so important.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a view out there that AI is sort of like the last, tech breakthrough that we would technically ever need, because the theory goes, right? You create AGI, it can solve all of your other problems for you. You just ask it like, hey, can you build a spaceship that gets us to Mars? Can you cure cancer? Can you do anything that we care about? What do you make of this?
Like I mean, I am learning along with everybody else, right? I mean, on one hand, it's like very cool tools, right? So I'm like super thrilled to have these tools available. On the other hand, like I see like many problems with a just it was like a super optimistic or pessimistic approach, right? Or regardless of where you come down. Like I think like the most likely thing is not that much changes, sadly. And part of this is like pattern matching from like past experience, right? So I'm old enough to remember like the 90s, the web, like everyone's like, oh, this is going to change everything. And okay, like on one hand, it did, like it changed a lot of social stuff, but it didn't really like fundamentally remake the economy in the way that we thought it would. And the example I like to give is like, if I want to sell my house, I'm probably still paying 6% to a realtor, which was like the biggest no-brainer thing that I thought the web would fix, right?
Yeah. Okay.
It's very
Yeah.
easy to like list a house and like disrupt like the real estate cartel, but like it turned out like no, it didn't do that. And I think there's going to be a lot of domains where AI is powerful and interesting and could theoretically do something, but it's going to be a long time in adoption. So like health sector, right? You could replace doctors for a lot of things with like a medical chatbot, or even something like interpreting test data or whatever. They're still going to want doctor eyes on it, like human doctor eyes on it, I think, for a long time. Now, okay, so that wasn't your question though. Like I think your question was like, is it going to be capable of doing a lot of these tasks? And I think like the tools are pretty good, but they have like some error rate. And if you're like sort of like layering task upon task, so if you think about like any interesting question is actually like a long series of like smaller, more isolated tasks. And if you have like a 1% error rate on each step, and it's like a 50-step problem, like it's not going to be like a reliable solution to the task. I mean, maybe there'll be some like sort of self-correcting or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, my inclination just looking at like the web, what else is going to save us? Crypto was going to save us, like smartphones,
Yeah.
we're gonna like be revolutionary. IoT, I remember like Internet of Things and like smart cities. We're gonna like revolutionize the economy. I'm not saying AI is like that, but I'm like have gotten to be like more skeptical that like I want to see it, right? Like I want to see the change before I like sort of pin my hopes I've hoped for fast growth for a long time, and I've just been
Yeah.
disappointed so many times that I don't see that. And then I think like the other thing is like I'm not sure people's mental models around AI are correct, right? So if we think about even like super intelligent AI, right? Like a much like I don't even know what this means, but like let's say that there's some entity that's like much smarter than us. Does it is that uniquely capable, right? In sort of a real world way. And I think about like what are the most competent and capable entities on our planet, it's like corporations, right? Like corporations are like they run the world, right? Like corporations run the world. Like are corporations smart? Right? If you think about it from like an information processing standpoint, they are very slow institutions. Like corporate, like input filters into the corporation, and then it like gets passed around like for like weeks or months before like a decision is made. Right? Like
Yeah.
they're like very bad at and in a sense they're like every single corporation on the planet is like dumber than you and me, and yet like they run the world and like we don't. So anyway, like speed of information processing or like doesn't seem to correlate with like actual like capabilities in the real world. So that's at least like a lingering doubt in my mind that we people have the right model here.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So I want to talk about your most recent post on Joseph Tainter's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. So his basic theory, right, is that you increase societal complexity, and then at some point you start to get diminishing returns to that complexity, which
Yeah.
eventually, people kind of get fed up, and then this can lead to collapse. And he makes the claim that it has in many cases in the past. The question I had for you, just like riffing on this, is it seems like our society is like way more complex by many orders of magnitude than past societies. So like why should we believe that like we'll hit some point where it becomes too complex?
Yeah. So the reason we can be more complex is because we have like a different sort of technological dispensation, right? So like we have the technological tools to turn that complexity into additional output at a much higher rate than past societies did. Right. So you could think about like one way to think about complexity is like how much specialization do you have, like say in the labor market, or like how many how many administrators do you have, right? If you think about like I don't know the Maya or Minoans or whatever, like if they if they got to a point where sort of the fraction of their economy was administrators that like ours is, I think they would have gotten fed up like way before we do, right? Like we could tolerate like a higher percentage of people being administrators because like to some extent like that administration does add value in our economy in a way that it wouldn't in like an agricultural society. And so it's not just like how complex are you in absolute terms, but like how complex are you to relative to like the technological dispensation, like how, and in particular, like what is the marginal return to that complexity? And it's different, and the answer is going to be different depending on how much technology you have available.
Ah, I see. So you're being more complex, but you're getting more returns.
Yes. So as long as you're getting like positive returns at the margin to like each additional unit of complexity, everything's fine.
Yeah. Until it starts to slope down. And
Until it's not. Yeah. Until you're starting to like actually like lose output from the additional complexity.
and so how much do you worry about this? Like, do you worry about Tainter's idea coming true for like the United States or leading Western nations today?
I'm not like by nature like a worrier, right? Like, but I think I would say not like terribly worried. But on the other hand, I think like is this a dynamic that seems to be going on right now? I would say like yeah, so like one of the things that Tainter identifies is like that it manifests in sort of like apathy to the like well-being of the polity, right? Like people don't care anymore about their society functioning or their society continuing to exist or doing well, or it's like a decline in maybe patriotism is like a related word here, but like not caring about their government or their, like not identifying with it and not and seeing it as like somewhat oppositional. And I think we have that in spades, right? I think we have like a lot of complexity. Like B, like we have a lot of like apathy or even hostility to like the current system. Like insofar as like you have people like repeating like Russian talking points about foreign policy and stuff like that. Like like it's like if you think about like the Romans got so fed up, the Roman peasants got so fed up that like when the barbarians came in, like they were like, come on in, like we don't care. And like that seems to be a thing that at least I don't know if you want to say 10% of the population or something like that we're there. So I do think it's relevant. I think like the cure is actually like higher returns, right? So like like more growth seems to be like basically the cure to the sort of like disease that Tainter is talking about. And both in the sense that like sort of exogenous growth, if we just got more growth, like, okay, like we'd have higher returns and that would be great. And then I think the other thing is like to get more growth, like we actually do need to sort of in a concerted way, like try to reduce complexity and root out sort of the negative value forms of complexity, like the bureaucratization and the over administration and the like over regulation of the economy. And if you kind of did that, that would also generate more growth. So different than exogenous growth, but just like actually like addressing the problem that Tainter identifies like head on and sort of like trying to cultivate our garden of complexity, let's say, like sort of weed out the bad parts of it. I think that would be really beneficial.
It seems like we've been really good. So you mentioned like you have two options, right? It's like continue to increase growth and abundance and then like decrease complexity. It seems like we've been really good at just like outrunning and finding growth in little pockets like over the last 100 years. Even if it's been slowing down, right? We're still kind of like eking it out relative to how bad things could be. But it doesn't really seem like we've done anything on reducing complexity. Like, do you think this is a problem that we're capable of solving? And do you see like any indications or areas of the economy where this has gone, where we've been able to reduce complexity?
Yeah, I don't know. I worry about this, right? Like this is I think coming out of George Mason and doing an econ PhD there, so like it's like the home of like public choice economics, right? And a lot of public choice analysis. So on one hand, it's like fully positive, right? It's not normative analysis. It's just like thinking about like how these actors interact or whatever. But a lot of it also is like very like if you want to translate it to like a more normative framework, a lot of the analysis is like very low agency, and it's just sort of like, well, this is the way it is. And so my view is like, oh no, we actually like, well, we don't have agency if we approach it with that attitude, right? If you kind of like just sort of assume like that's the way it is, okay, that's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you can approach it with higher agency, like these policies and stuff, like people do make and influence policies all the time. So like, why not us? Right? Why not? Why wouldn't we be the people to do that? I think we can make progress on it. I do I do worry that it's like it is we are fighting an uphill battle in the sense that it's much easier to add complexity than it is to like systematically reduce it.
How do you stack rank just got like internal collapse from the Tainter model against like the more commonly talked about existential risks like nuclear war or AI kills us all or something? Like which one do you think we should be more concerned with?
Well, they're different, right? So like even sort of like the collapsed societies, it's not like everybody dies, right? So if you're approaching it from a Will McCaskill EA perspective, right? Like it sounds like he's like actually like concerned about like literally everybody dying and like all the future value getting wiped out. I don't think the Tainter collapse model would support that being as important of a risk. I'm much more concerned about like the Tainter style collapse, in part because it's happened like a couple dozen times already in history, right? So it's like this is a thing that we know happens. I think the other thing is, a lot of the existential risk stuff is it's like iterated first principles reasoning, which I don't actually think is a very good method, right? Like it could be like a very rational person, but like you take some premise, a couple of premises, you draw a conclusion that becomes like your new premise, then you do it over and over again. Like it doesn't take much error anywhere in that chain to like make your ultimate conclusion like completely fallacious. So I just don't actually think that's a very good method. Asteroid risk is a thing that like that has also happened. Like there's
Yep.
like empirical data on that. So it's like we should take that seriously. Maybe the dinosaurs didn't have a space program, which is bad for them. Like yeah, like 20 something times in the last 5,000 years we've had this complexity cycle. That seems like worth a few thoughts. We're thinking about.
Okay. Okay. So final question here. Let's say a young high schooler, they stumble upon your blog and they say, I want to help get total factor productivity to 2%. This is my goal. You've inspired me. What do you tell them to do with their career?
I mean, I would say like be curious. I would say like actually don't look at it as a career. I would look at it more as a series of jobs, which sound like the same thing, but it's actually different, right? You're not like optimizing. I don't think you're optimizing like the next 40 years of your impact. I think that's just like an impossible task. I would think of it in more like five-year chunks. Like think about like what do you want to do in the next 5 years that's going to set you up to add value. And I think a big piece of it is like find what you think is the most interesting thing going on right now. Given your values and your interest in growth, I'm assuming that's going to be like a growth producing activity. But find out what you think is most interesting and like find a way to like put yourself at the center of that activity, right? Like and then just like get there and just like indiscriminately add value, and don't worry about being compensated for it. Just like add value to everybody around you, and like that's how you advance in your field, and people will want you around if you're just like indiscriminately producing value because they want to be around people who indiscriminately produce value. So yeah, I don't think there's like master plan, but like follow that interest and follow that passion, and then just add value, and then over a course of like 5 years, like what you find most interesting in the world might change, and then just like do it again, right? Again, and you'll have like a series of like big contributions that probably take you somewhere interesting, but not like a planned career.
Eli, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. This is great questions.